All right, let's move on with our next part. Let's look at reactions to imperialism. So we're talking about how the Western and industrial powers of the world are going to start spreading and conquering and colonizing other parts of the world, the non-industrial parts. And it is a mistake to assume that the people getting conquered were passive. They kind of just stood there and did nothing as their places were conquered. But it wasn't always a 100% resistance against the colonization or imperial process. So what we have is a mixed bag of reactions. Sometimes the people cooperated. So the elites of a society are going to want to cooperate with, when the Europeans or the Americans or whoever's shows up to conquer, because they're the ones who are at most risk of losing everything, because they're the elites, they're in the upper class. So what we see is that many upper class people are going to quickly, kind of cooperative and collaborate and join sides with the incoming imperial power in order to kind of guarantee that they're still going to have a top position. Sometimes we see that it's going to be this violent reaction. Wars are going to break out in an attempt to kick out or reduce the spread of imperial power. So sometimes we have, for example, the Sepoy Rebellion is a violent mutiny, violent uprising of Indian soldiers against British rule. And it was violently ended with the British military coming in and using their weaponry to stop this from this rebellion from spreading. We see that in this map there are tons of examples of rebellions and people rebelling against imperial rule all over Africa. Right, so these people were not just standing by and doing nothing. Right, they were trying to resist, they're trying to fight back. But keep in mind that most of the times these were not successful simply because they were outmatched, technologically speaking. Now there is kind of like this one unique exception, and it was called the Anglo Zulu War. So in South Africa, one of the many different tribes that lived there, African tribes, were the Zulus, and the British settlers wanted to remove the Zulus from their land, and the Zulus, of course, fought for independence or fought against this movement. And it was the British, when they kind of start the war, they really underestimate the fighting capability of the Zulu. So they will send a small group of soldiers to fight against the entire Zulu army, assuming that with the technological advantage, it should be an easy cake type of win or type of fight. So very early on, the Zulus were actually able to stop the British from advancing, stop the British from expanding into their lands, and push back the imperial power. And eventually, the British will come in with more firepower to put an end to it. And this is one of those famous battles in South Africa during the Anglo Zulu War. Now, sometimes people simply adapted to living under Western rule. And again, these are going to be more your upper class people in society. They're simply going to adapt to the fact that the Westerners are in charge. They're going to try to keep their positions, keep their jobs, so that if they need to get educated, they will get educated. If they need to dress in Western styles and learn one of the Western languages, they will, because they will kind of give them a safe position working for the government, working for businesses, and stuff like that. We also see that sometimes, as soon as the imperial power took over, there's going to be a fight for self-rule. Some people are going to want to fight back and wait for independence or fight for independence. And those movements are going to start in the late 1800s, right, during the age of imperialism, but they're not going to really kick off until after the First World War, which we'll talk about when we get to Unit 6. Now, one of the unique reactions that we see in South Africa is something called the Xhosa cattle killing movement. And basically what we see is that with the arrival of the Europeans and European livestock, many African animals, African cows or cattle, died from this weird infection, this weird disease that had been spread to those lands. And the Xhosa people, which is one of the other tribes in South Africa, come to this kind of like belief based on their traditional religious practices, that if they slaughter their cows, all their cows, thousands and thousands of cows, then their spirits of the ancestors will come in and help them kick out the British. And you could imagine that if you kill your entire cattle population and you are a herding tribe and there's no more animals to herd, you're going to basically have a famine. So this kind of like weird reaction, right? Of course, it was totally unsuccessful. They ended up having a famine and many of them died from starvation. But we see kind of that desperation of colonial resistance against the imperial power, and this is the Xhosa cattle killing movement. We also have anti-colonial nationalism, right? So sometimes we see that the people start viewing themselves as a group, as a nation, right, for the simple fact that they've all been conquered by a foreign industrial power. And we see the first kind of like steps towards nationalism in India. So remember, of course, the Indians were always, not only were separated because of their faith, right? Some of them being Hindus and some of them being Muslims, or most of them being Hindus and some of them being Muslims. But they're also isolated because India itself was politically fragmented into smaller kingdoms and territories. And therefore, there wasn't a country or a concept of India. Even though, of course, there's Indians. So so what we start seeing is that once the British come in and take over India and create that British Raj, the Indians are going to start viewing themselves as Indians, as a separate group of people from the British, and start setting aside their differences, right? And they're kind of start uniting under this common goal of independence, of freedom. And that's where we see the creation of a group called the Indian National Congress. And they're going to work together with another group called the Muslim League, and they're going to be made up of educated Indians, right? Hindus and Muslims. And these are Indians who have gone to England or to Britain and studied there and come back with notions of nationalism and Enlightenment ideas about self-rule and self-government and capitalism and freedom and rights and liberties and Bill of Rights, all those good things we mentioned before. So they're going to use the very same concepts that the Europeans have been using later on in the 20th century. We're going to see that the Indians are going to bring up those same ideas when they start beginning their independence movement. Now, a similar response we'll see in India. We are also going to see in China. Remember, the Chinese are going to rebel against the foreign influence, whether it's during the Taiping Rebellion against the Qing dynasty, or in the against the foreigners in the Boxer Rebellion. And of course, China at the beginning of the 20th century is going to eventually become a republic, a nationalist republic. Similar movements start in Africa, but they kind of take a little bit longer. And again, because remember, there was no nation in Africa. Right? There was a lot of tribes that were kind of like small scale in territory. And on top of that, those tribes were like split or forced to live together because of the European made boundaries in Africa, right? On their colonies that they carved up during that Berlin Conference, right? At the start of the scramble for Africa. But in Africa, again, we'll see the beginnings, right, the spark of nationalism, of this idea of natural rights and popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, by the way, means the idea that the people, right, the public, gets to decide who will be their rulers, right, and what type of government they have, right, that whole contract, social contract concept. So the elites are going to be kind of the first people in these colonial societies to unite, to put aside their differences, to unite under a banner, under a belief of nationalism. And these are going to be the same people also that are going to work with the imperial powers, working in government and in business, high levels of government and business. All right, so this is it, right? All the reactions. We have the violent ones, we have the rebellious ones, we have the more, nicer ones that kind of play along nicely, and then we see, of course, the nationalism as one of the other responses. All right, thanks for listening and watching, and I'll see you next time for the next part.